Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we are back for episode number 18. Rod, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing fine, man.
Yeah.
It finally got hot here in
Oh,
Budapest. And by hot, I mean it basically feels like late March in Louisiana.
right.
But summer seems to have finally arrived, and things have been so unbelievably busy. I know we'll have a chance to talk about it in a second, but
Yeah, I do.
first,
Yeah.
I have to thank you for sending me. I mean, in the sense, in the hathos sense, in the sense of giving me something that's so awful, it helped me to enjoy it.
Yeah.
What they played at the end of the gay blessing ceremonies in the Catholic churches in Germany. Would you want to enlighten our readers, our listeners, with what you?
I mean, as much as I can. So as everyone. Oh, wait, I shouldn't say that. As folks in the sort of the Catholic online space probably know that our current Pope Francis has pushed this idea of synodality, which is in certain respects a kind of corrective against a sort of a heavy top-down, what Rome says, and then sort of spreads it out to the rest of the satellite dioceses around the world. And and to that extent, I don't necessarily have a big beef with the idea. I mean, maybe sort of resetting a little bit of those power imbalances that can arise from a sort of a high, maybe even quasi ultramontanist take on the papacy.
This is
right?
quite a wind up to the punchline.
It's okay. It's okay. I know, but I want to be fair, because I don't want people to accuse me of just sort of throwing hate in my at my own house here, so to speak. But I will. Don't worry. And so the Germans have really taken this idea to heart. This sort of idea of synodality. And what they're essentially doing is that they are basically telling Rome to go fly a kite. Especially when it comes to matters of sex, matters of marriage, and ultimately matters of human anthropology. And so a few months ago, I guess it was, Rod, the CDF made the pronouncement
The CDF being the doctrinal office of the church.
Yeah.
It said that no to Catholic blessing same-sex Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a surprise to no one who actually sort of follows these theological, movements and ideas. The church just simply said no. We're not going to bless same-sex unions. And so the Germans said, well, all the normal people could sort of wrung their hands and said, well, this is a shame and this is a tragedy, and the Supiches and the
How can love win?
And then, but all the Germans, and this is one of those times where I'm really sad that I don't speak German, because I really would kind of like to read the German responses to all of this. Well, the German church said, well, we're not going to listen to what the CDF says. And so just this morning on the Twitter, yes, I have fallen off the wagon. On the Twitter, it is announced that the Germans did a kind of mass small m, a mass blessings of unions in multiple locations throughout Germany. I think it was yesterday, or maybe it may have been.
And they hashtagged it Liebe gewinnt, love wins.
Love wins. So, but so anyway, that's sad in the sense that a genuine sort of belief in a unity of the church is being actively attacked, right? But secondly, the real hilarious point was that at the culmination they play the Song of Songs, and I don't mean the book from the Bible. I mean John Lennon's Imagine.
Yes,
Just perfect.
That's perfect. Now, it's so perfect because it's the anthem of boomer atheism, utopian atheism, and it is a sterile song for a sterile, dying church. And I'm talking the liberal church in Germany, but they're so proud of themselves.
Oh yeah. This is it's so hilariously on brand and so hilariously inappropriate. I mean, if you've even had if you've even remembered a few of the lyrics of that simpery song, you know that it is laughably absurd to play that particular song at a church. I mean, it's amazing.
Imagine there's no heaven. But that's what's so weird about this song. It seems to have become the anthem for secular utopianism. And yet there it is at a church. It's so appropriate. It says so much more about these ceremonies than anything else. And one thing that's so interesting too is the Southern Baptists back in the U.S. are watching a real-time collapse in their ban on female clergy. They don't have priests, obviously they have pastors, but it has been a rock solid part of Baptist doctrine, I guess, that no women pastors. And that's falling apart right now. I noticed that over the weekend, Saddleback Church, which is a Southern Baptist congregation, that's Rick Warren's big congregation.
Massive.
They ordained 3 women. And I was thinking about this because you're Catholic, I'm Orthodox, and this is it's a total impossibility,
right?
Because our priests play a sacramental function that we do not believe women can do ontologically,
right?
But it seems like a much more difficult thing for Baptists to hold the line on that, because there's no ontological function or no sacramental function of their clergy. I mean, they are leaders of an assembly who teach. I mean, maybe we should have a Baptist on here to explain this, but it just seems to me that our friends, our Southern Baptist friends, have a much weaker position to stand up to defend tradition.
Yeah, I've always sort of felt that. I've always sort of worried about my Southern Baptist friends and comrades, whatever you want to call us, fellow travelers. I know I'm using all this Marxist language, but I think it fits in a weird way. But we as sort of liturgical traditions, we have this sort of embedded sense that sex is meaning bearing, right? That there is a sacramentality to sex, and in a certain respects gender, but really sex first. And look, this is a long and drawn out conversation and relatively theologically nuanced, but I think it has to contend on some level with the fact, that Jesus was a man, not just a human being, but was a man. And so at any rate, I am not surprised that the Southern Baptist Convention is vulnerable to this, especially as they have been weakened by the social justice movements. And it's not like your tradition or my tradition is immune to these sort of in-house attacks on foundational matters. Of course, you and I, this animates both of us, both together and within our respective traditions. But I've always thought that without an actual priesthood, right? Because a priest, as you and I know, is not just a teacher. In fact, he's not even primarily a teacher. He's a sacrificer. This is what, and this is a long, sort of history going back in and through the Jews of the high priest, the idea of a high priest as this sort of person set aside to perform a very specific function for the people as an intermediary between us and God. So not terribly surprised. I mean, what are you hearing from your Southern Baptist friends about this?
Oh, they're really struggling. I'm still waiting. It's afternoon here in Budapest, and I just got the news about this, and I've written to my Southern Baptist friends to ask them what the heck is going on. But sure. Having grown up in a small town where there was a big Southern Baptist church, I always knew that they were the most conservative church in town, but as I got older and understood more about Christianity, I came to see that so much of their conservatism was bound up in the culture. And now the thing I saw this morning shows that a healthy majority of evangelicals themselves approve of female ordination. I don't know how many of those are Southern Baptists, but I think it's going to be very, very hard to hold the line if you don't have this sort of sacramental view of the clergy, which they don't. It's going to be hard for us to hold the line. I think it will hold because the weight of the tradition, the doctrine is so strong, but it just doesn't make sense to modern people who have been acculturated as most of us have. And I mean, it looks like because nobody's bothered to tell our people why the sacramental priesthood has to be male only.
Right.
I mean, look, we live in a culture, Kale, where we don't believe that sex itself is an embedded reality, embedded part of reality. We believe that you can flip male and female.
Right. I mean, this is the era, as you and I have quipped about before. We live in the world of meat Legos. That the human person is you can rip it apart and put it back together in any conceivable way. And due to the glories, quote unquote, of modern medicine and technology, we can create a simulacrum of male and female, independent and overlaid on X, Y, and XX chromosomes. There's no stopping principle to the rise and the triumph of the modern self, to riff a little bit on Carl Trueman here. And and I think this helps me make a little bit more sense of somebody like David French. I know y'all are friends, and in certain respects I admire a lot of what he does, but he just cannot see maybe he does see it. Maybe I'm gonna give him some credit. I think he sees how embedded American evangelical culture is in culture as opposed to sacramental theology. So therefore I do think that they are particularly prone to these critiques of critical social justice as regards to sex, as regards to race, that it's very difficult for them to do it. So therefore, all of they really are left with, I think, and please guys correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but all they are left with is, you just don't want to have female priests or female pastors because of existing cultural bigotries. Just like you didn't want to have Black people in your congregation.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to get in before we get into the meat of what I know you want to talk about today I do. Just in the past few days, our alma mater, mine and yours, LSU, Louisiana State University, has hired a new president. He's a Black man named William Tate IV. When I first heard about this, I thought, oh, that's great. LSU has its first Black president. But then it came out that this guy, Professor Tate, is one of the top critical race theorists in the country. He's been working on critical race theory for 25 years. And my jaw dropped, because here we have the LSU Board of Supervisors who have hired a critical race theorist to be president of the state university. And my first thought, I don't really know why they did this, but I thought, how well is this going to go over in Louisiana? And how could this happen? Well, my theory is, and that's all it is a theory, is they know that because they themselves, the Board of Supervisors and the administration of LSU, did such a terrible job policing the former football coach, Les Miles, who has been accused of sexually harassing female workers there, and also handling athletes in their sexual abuse. They're going to get hit really, really hard by the NCAA. And so my suspicion is they're trying to woke up as a way to protect themselves. Now, why is
it seems compensatory, Rada. I mean, it really does.
Yeah. Well, why this is so important to me, aside from the fact that, I have a kid at the school, it's my alma mater, is this shows, right. I mean, this shows exactly how the revolution goes forward. They have, they will have conquered, the woke will have conquered or planted their flag at the summit of the most important educational institution in a very conservative state.
Right.
And they did this because the elites, the mostly white elites who run the LSU Board of Supervisors, capitulated and did this. I've been trying to explain to people in Hungary how they're wondering, how is this happening in America? Why does this keep happening? And I say that it's mostly a matter of the elites refusing to do their job, and for whatever reason, opening the door to the woke to come in. And my God, we've seen it right now at LSU. It's breathtaking.
Well, I mean, I think, I think one of the operating principles here is that once again, the critical social justice movement has been able to co-opt the righteous work of the civil rights movement, and we have to get it in our heads that the current critical social justice movement does not carry forward the work of the civil rights movement. It is a form of neo-racism. And if we look at its record, if we look at what happens to institutions that adopt this as their sort of operating principle, as their kind of this upgraded 2.0 operating system or 3.0 operating system, all it does is it destroys institutions. It destroys communities. It destroys friendships. It destroys people at the individual level. I think it really has this strange way of colonizing the self. It kind of drives you a little bit batty. It kind of drives you a little bit mad. And I see this all over the place. But it'll be fascinating. Honestly, it'll be fascinating to watch. I'm in Rhode Island now, as everyone knows, and it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens to LSU because, when I was there, especially in graduate school in the 90s, you had an entire professor. Now, I was in an English department, and so as you might expect, the English department was probably was certainly amongst the most progressive of the departments, but all the departments in the humanities were essentially progressive. And even most of the sciences were essentially progressive. I can't speak to the engineering schools or the veterinarian schools or anything like that, but in my milieu, it was very, very progressive. And basically, I don't know, some vast majority of the professor was basically embarrassed and frustrated that they no longer lived in New Haven, that they were no longer sort of amongst the smart people of Yale or Princeton or Harvard or even, some of these bigger places, Berkeley, and they were always very frustrated that they lived in the backwards state of Louisiana. And so I think that this will very quickly capture the professorate if it already hasn't. I'm sure it already has. What I'm really interested to see is what is this going to do in the student body? I mean, I think that'll be fascinating.
Yeah, well, and to the alumni and the parents. I mean, do you really think that the taxpayers of Louisiana are going to sit back and be grateful for their children to be taught to hate themselves for the color of their skin? Yeah. Although they might. I mean, this is the thing that's so crazy about wokeness is it's taking over the middle class. This is what middle class people believe. And to connect this to what we were just talking about with whether it's Liebe in Germany or the female women's ordination with the Southern Baptists, we begin to see the power of middle class culture. What middle class people believe and want to believe ends up setting the tone for these institutions, even if the institutions are supposed to be about something else.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought it back really quick because I think right now there's probably a lot of what we might call preference falsification amongst the kids, amongst the students. In other words, you sort of go along to get along. You might secretly harbor that, gosh, some of this stuff sounds kind of nuts. I thought that we were supposed to, that all of us matter. And yeah, fine. I don't have a problem saying Black Lives Matter, but I also kind of want to say that all lives matter. And why can't I say that? I'm confused. I was brought up in a kind of different, sort of frame of mind. And now all of a sudden I have to really pay attention to all this sort of stuff. So I wonder if there is some preference falsification going on, and how long does that go on? I mean, we see this, I know I'm going to do that thing that we tend to do, which is you jump to sort of the meta level or the historical level. And, this is the house of cards that tends to be communist regimes, right? There's tons of preference falsification. You can't be the one, for instance, to stop clapping for Stalin first, because if you're the one who stops clapping for Stalin first, you go to the gulag. That just is what it is. And so I think there's a preservation principle that's going on here. And again, I just think it's sad that we are running again this same experiment now in a colonized middle class milieu. This is really going to be fascinating and sad. But my last thing to say before I kick it back to you is, when, if I'm thinking both in terms of sort of the critical social justice movement and the stuff we talked about with the Southern Baptist Convention and the German synodal way, when is a break a break? When is an institution no longer one? And when does that matter?
Well, I think that we're going to have the answer, whether it's going to come at us faster than we think. Hearing you talk about this. Remind me, on last Friday, I met with a guy here, a retired Reformed bishop. The Reformed, they're like 10% of the Hungarian population is Reformed, and from Calvinist.
Calvinist, yeah.
Yeah, and this guy, the retired bishop, Istvan Szabo is his name. He said that when he looks at what's happening to the churches, the Protestant churches of the United States and the West, his jaw drops because they're deconstructing themselves so quickly. And we went on from talking about that to talking about Western society as a whole. And we had a guy who was with us there in the room when we were talking, a Hungarian, who was talking about his relatives back in America and how one of them said that her daughter came home from school saying, they were talking about Black Lives Matter in my school today, getting the woke indoctrination. And I said, but all lives matter. And my relatives, the mom said that you can't say that outside the house. Well, to say that in Hungary to a man, a bishop, who born in 56, who grew up under this. I mean, I've had this experience so many times, Kale, over here reporting the book, Live Not by Lies. They see what's happening. And that led the Hungarian to talk about silence is violence, and then he told the very same story you just told about how you can't be the first one to stop clapping. So it's all converging, and it's just, my head is spinning to be over here in a former communist country and to talk to people, this bishop who had to lead his flock through communism, and to see how shocked he is, because he didn't know anything about my book, Live Not by Lies. It's in the process of being translated now, but to see it's all making sense to him.
Wow. What a strange sort of confirmation of your instincts. This might sound like a cheesy question to you, but I mean, like, honestly, I really do mean this honestly. Like, how does this feel to be watching this unfold when the project that you began some 2.5 years ago, right? 2.5 years ago was really an intuition on your part. And to sort of see this, you just said convergence happen. I mean, what is that like, honestly, just as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And it makes me so grateful that I listened to these people who were warning me, these refugees, people the same age as Bishop Szabo. But it also, doing this here from Hungary, where, the Orban government, we've talked about this on my podcast before, they've been widely condemned in the West for being authoritarian and illiberal and things like that. And, and the criticism is not all wrong. But the thing that just blows my mind is how completely blind these critics are to how they're doing the same thing back in America. Our institutions are so illiberal and have become illiberal in the name of progressivism. I mean, this is a broken record thing for you and me, but to actually see it, and to see it from this perspective, and to watch when you're sitting there with this man who led his flock under communism, and to talk about how America is, he said to himself, he goes, I can't, where is the promised land? And what he meant by that was not that there was any earthly utopia, but he was trying to explain this in the context of, we grew up thinking the West had it all figured out. He said, now you can't look to the West. He said, there is no fruit there. There is no milk. There is no honey. And I think he's right. But where is it?
That's tough to hear. No, I know. And I again, for me, it's hunches, but man, it's fascinating to listen to your perspective as sort of being out of the country and being able to look at the thing and kind of walk around the thing as it is unfolding.
Well, I want to say one quick thing before we jump in. Sorry. I'm meeting tomorrow. I don't know when this is going to air, but I'll be meeting on Thursday with a reporter, a freelancer for the New York Times Magazine, who's doing a piece about I was doing a piece about the rise of post-liberal conservatives, people like me, Sora Bamari, Patrick Deneen, and others. And I don't know who I know she's reached out to some people I know, and most of them aren't talking to her because they quite rightly don't trust the New York Times. But I felt that I had a responsibility to talk to her because, unlike some of the people she's reached out to, my position is not threatened. I work for a conservative magazine who are happy. I'm not an academic, for example. And so I can't be punished. But we came to an agreement where she would share with me all the quotes of mine she's planning to use before she uses them, because she recognizes, she's not a dummy. She recognizes that people like us have a huge problem trusting.
Look, don't get Petersoned. I would just recommend, make a recording of that interview.
Oh,
yourself.
I will.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. But the reason I even bring that up is because when I sit down with her, I'm going to have to explain this to her. I'm like, it's not something that is at all clear to people of progressive or even liberal persuasion. Mm-hmm. But my God, from the point of view of people like us, the illiberalism and the blind illiberalism, the reflexive illiberalism, the indignant illiberalism of the left is what we're reacting against. Now, and I'm probably having to tell her this, the thing that I'm being dragged kicking and screaming into is a realization that the old-fashioned liberalism of the sort that I would like to live in, where people of the left and right can coexist and we argue and all that, but there's a basic connection there. We all feel like we're part of the same society. Mm-hmm. That I'm afraid that just is disappearing, if it's not already gone.
Yeah, well, I wondered if it's one of these things where we said last time, right? Or I said, sorry, and put words in your mouth, but we've awakened from this great nap, and I strongly feel that we have been asleep. And that the encroachment is real, that the atomization that has been predicted for years and years and years is upon us, and we no longer know how to interact with one another. I have been noticing, Rod, over the years, some of my favorite bits that you've worked into your blog have been when you get to sit down with somebody blows through town off the I-10 in Baton Rouge, and you get to sit down with them and talk to them, and you'll sort of come back, your sort of small town reportage. I've always enjoyed those stories from you, but I always knew that you basically sort of hole yourself up in Casa de Dreer, and you read and you write, and that's what you do, and there's not a lot going on in your actual life, and so you do lots and lots of reading and writing. Now I have to say, I'm going to voice some concern here. You actually have a life. I'm worried about what it's like to live in a place in which you go out to eat for lunch, you go meet this bishop, and you go see this official, you get having an interview with a New York Times reporter. I mean, how is this affecting your vocation as a writer?
That's a really important question. It is. I've realized, I'll be quite blunt here, I've realized in the 3 weeks I've been here in Hungary, it's been so busy in all the best ways. I'm meeting interesting people, walking around this beautiful city, eating good food. Just it feels like, wow, life is back. And I've had to realize that my prolific nature as a writer has been weirdly connected to unhappiness, or to loneliness, or to a sense of being in exile. Now, I've talked in the past, and in fact, I wrote about this on my Substack, that I've been having bad dreams since I've been here about the breakup of my family back, which took place about a decade ago when I moved back to Louisiana. And, it turns out that things we weren't the happy family I thought we were, and everything fell apart. But I thought that was in the past for me. It turns out to be, you hear that?
Yeah, that's all right.
I'm sorry to tell you that I'm in my apartment in Budapest, and this microphone is so great. It's picking up workmen in another part of the building on the other side of the building. Anyway,
authentic. It's okay.
All right. So anyway, let me get back to what I was saying. But it's suddenly it's like those bodies that I thought were well buried have come back up, but I'm trying to figure out why exactly it is, Kale. And I realized that writing has been for me a way of dealing with that sense of exile and sense of loss. I was thinking actually about Dante. Certainly not to compare myself to Dante, but Dante was a writer, but he didn't become the writer of the Commedia until he went into permanent exile.
That's right. Now that doesn't mean he was a writer before. So what do you mean?
Right. He was a well-known poet, but he didn't become Dante great until he was kicked out of Florence and could not go home again. He wrote out of a sense of pain of exile. And I'm starting to wonder my own writing vocation if it has so much more to do with a sense of a pain of exile than I realized. And
Mm-hmm.
I got to tell you, I've loved being here, and I needed this in the worst way. And I've been so cooped up in the house for so long, and COVID made it worse. And now suddenly, it's like the lights are back on again. But I know I'm not living in real life. I know that this is a Disneyfied version of life. And in fact, I couldn't live like this forever. If this were the life offered me, this life of dinners and interesting people and great conversation. But if I had to give up writing to have it, I'd rather go back to the hole. And it's weird.
Yeah, I'm reminded of an essay I read years ago, and I meant to look this up before we had a chance to sit down and talk, because this is something I've been thinking about in terms of you, and to a certain extent me, and we can get into me next time. But Walker Percy talks about why he can't live in New Orleans. And the reason, is so instead he lived in Covington, and he called New Orleans a place, a real
Covington,
place.
a small town across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans.
And so New Orleans was a real place with a real ethos and a real, going on. And Covington, certainly at the time, it's gotten built up now, but it's really just a large suburb separated by a lake and a 24-mile bridge. It's really a suburb of New Orleans, but it at the time when he was writing, it was pretty pretty rural, and there was very little. What he called it a no place, and he didn't mean that disrespectfully. I mean, I think he really loved living in Covington, and it's not about cracking on Covington, but he said he needed it, like from his standpoint of his vocation as a writer, that he needed to be away from a place in order to see a place. And not necessarily, he wasn't writing about New Orleans, but New Orleans crowded out his imagination. It was like sort of too satisfying.
Yeah.
And I think he felt that he needed to live in a no place so that he could see reality stripped of its illusions, which is interesting. Now that I'm saying this out loud, this is precisely what Dante's task is in, especially Inferno, right? The goal of what Virgil needs him to see in this descent into hell and ultimately out of hell is sin stripped of its illusion. That all the souls in hell are caught up with the projections on Plato's wall, and he needs to sort of see like what it really is. And so when he sees these sinners and he sees its increasing grotesquerie in the descent, he now is no longer swooning at the story of Paolo and Francesca, but he's kicking Bocca in the head, because sin should properly outrage us. So anyway, I think the deeper point here for our purposes is that Dante needs to be able to see clearly, that the function, the vocation of the writer is to be able to see clearly. And how clearly can you see it if you're living in a place?
Yeah, and, I've been here, as I said, 3 weeks, and already getting pushback on my blog if I say something nice about the Hungarian government or Viktor Orban. I mean, they just jump all over me. And what I want to tell them is like, wait a minute, I write a daily diary. That's what a blog is. It's a web blog. And I'm meeting. I set up today. I reached out to somebody who was an opposition figure here, because I just want to, but who's known. I was told by a friend of mine who supports the government. But I said, look, I want to talk to somebody who's in the opposition, but who's fair and who's not just going to give me propaganda. And so we're working on setting that up, because I really want to know what's going on here. But things are so polarized here in Hungary between Fidesz, the government party, and the opposition, that it reminds me a lot of America. And I know that as an outsider, I'm coming here and I've met so far with people from the government and people who are broadly sympathetic to the government. But I'm told just this morning, I had lunch with a student who said that, among my generation here in Budapest, they're strongly against the government. Right. And she said, if you get out into the countryside, that's when you're going to find the real Fidesz supporters. And again, it reminds me a lot of what we're dealing with.
That's classic, though. I mean, that was classic of the, the English Reformation. The countryside remained Catholic for, 2 generations before it finally, got reformed by
Right.
which were essentially urban forces. People forget that the Puritans in our country have this reputation as being these sort of retrograde, proto-fascists, which they kind of were. But the Puritans were the progressives of the time. The conservatives were like the sort of the old soil and smells and bells Catholicism, papolatry and all of that sort of stuff. It was the city dwellers. It was really London and other cities in England that were the progressive forces in the guise of Puritans. In fact, the crack, that the progressive Puritans made against the establishment are very similar to the way you hear progressive, DSAers in our own country, Democratic Socialists of America, and the various podcasts, the way that they attack the Democratic establishment. Their attack on the Democratic establishment is they're basically Republicans with a different color tag, and the exact same way that the Puritans saw the Anglican middle wayers as sort of sellouts to papolatry. So it's an interesting dynamic that gets played out.
But to go back to your original question, though, so what does this mean for my vocation as a writer? I really don't know. It's been such a balm to me to suddenly get out of the house and shake that hermetic, or not hermetic, eremitic thing I have that I've fallen into, and I get out into the world and see people and experience that joy. It's been great. But as I said earlier, I would not accept this at the price of my vocation. So I don't know what it's going to mean long term. I would like to find more balance in my life, but if it's offered to me, if the opportunity comes up for that, and maybe for me, it's going to be about spending part of the year in a place like this, or and I'm gonna have to figure out why I've struggled so much to develop deep friendships in Louisiana. And to be honest, I think it's something as simple as we live in a car culture.
Yeah.
I mean, my son Matt's here with me, and he's been here about a week now. And one of the things we've really enjoyed is the fact that the city is so walkable and so small that, I mean, this is a major European capital, but you can get most places you want to go within 40 minutes on foot. And Matt, on one of his first nights here, we're walking down one of the small side streets near where we're living in central Budapest. And Matt said, it's so human scaled.
Yeah. People, I haven't been back to Europe since, probably been 20 years now, at least 20 years. When I first went, I went to Rome and spent about 3.5 months in Rome, 4 months in Rome. And that was the thing. I couldn't believe it. Like, I didn't jump into a car for 4 months. And, Rome is a big city, but really human. And I don't think we have really an equivalent in the United States. New Orleans is tiny, but even the tiny part of New Orleans is not really where people effectively live.
Right.
But in Rome, I mean, it was amazing. You walk everywhere, and it was great. I found it so liberating, and it's interesting that Matthew immediately latched onto this idea that it's human in scale.
Yeah, and he's an avid cyclist too, and he's already been cycling all over. And cycling's a big thing here, and but it's great as an American to get this glimpse of how people live elsewhere, and to see that life can be different. Although it does make you really depressed about car culture, and to see how much that has contributed to the atomization of people.
Yeah. So okay, I want to talk a little bit about that. This atomization idea. I've been thinking a lot about authenticity. Living an authentic life, and that we seem to be once again living through a crisis of authenticity. And naturally, the way we, you and I as Christians believe that the only mechanism through which you can be authentic is to be a saint, right? Is to be holy. And the only way to be holy is to live out your vocation, to respond to the call, which is fundamentally a response to a call to heroism. And I wonder why we care so much about the critical social justice stuff, for instance, why this latest round of things at LSU is really kind of animating you, like why you feel this is so frustrating. And I just wonder, when did you know that it was your vocation to be a journalist? Because I've heard you say something about LSU before. And
right. Well, it was at LSU. I came to LSU in 1985 as an undergraduate and to study political science because I was interested in politics. And summer of 1987, between my sophomore and junior year, I didn't want to go home to St. Francisville to live with my mom and dad. So I invented a reason to stay in Baton Rouge and take classes. And I got a job at the LSU campus newspaper.
Writing editorials. The Reveille.
I wrote editorials. And I wrote an editorial that the Reveille advisor said, that's pretty good. I bet you could win the Hearst College journalism competition with that, but you have to change your major to journalism. So I changed my major to journalism because
that's an incentive. That's an incentive right there.
Well, it was about AIDS. This was 87, about discovering that one of my high school friends had become HIV positive. And besides, I liked dealing with politics as a journalist. Well, anyway, I entered the contest. I won. I was the best college editorial writer in the country in 1987. And that it was just kind of went on from there. But I don't want to be too high-minded about this, Kale. For me, journalism was just fun. I liked to write. I liked reading polemical journalism of the left and the right. I liked mixing it up that way. But I don't know that if I were 18, 19-year-old me now, I don't know if I could see journalism that way because it seems so much more bitter and less joyful.
Well, yeah, okay. But that's a slightly different issue. In other words, whatever that compulsion was that you had in you, whatever you were there's this sort of this inner response to something, right? Today in 2021, young Rod Dreher might not have majored in journalism.
Right.
But there's still the compulsion to sort of do this sort of engagement, this sort of work, right?
Yeah, I see where you're going. And around that same time, somebody gave me a copy of Rainer Maria Rilke's the Letters to a Young Poet, which everybody,
that's great.
Everybody our age, when you're an undergraduate, you read this book, and it's a wonderful book. It's a series of letters that Rilke, one of the greatest, probably the greatest German poet of the 20th century, wrote to a young man named Franz Capus. Capus wrote Rilke and said, "Hey, I think I might have a vocation to be a poet. How can I know this?" And so he and Rilke exchanged letters, and they were later gathered and published as Letters to a Young Poet, and they're wonderful. Something Rilke said to Capus stood out. I remember exactly where I was when I read it. I was lying in my unair-conditioned room in Louise Garrick Hall at LSU. Yeah. Rilke said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said to Capus, "You have to ask yourself, if I could not write at all, they wouldn't let me write, could I live? If there's something else you can go do, then you should go do that. But if your answer is, no, I don't think I could live without writing, then you might have what it takes to be a writer." Well, that really kind of unnerved me because I'm like, how would you know this? How would you know this? Yeah. But it struck me as deeply true. Well, I read that when I was maybe 19. I'm 54 now. It's deeply true. I write because I write. I don't write because I want to achieve something in particular. I usually don't know what I think about anything until I've written about it. And this too is why so much of my life is spent as a writer. I mean, I have felt strangely bound here in Budapest. It's been so much to do that I need to do as part of this fellowship here, and I've been enjoying it. But I just want everything to go quiet so I can process it through writing, And so I'll be a writer no matter what. But the weird thing is, what if you couldn't get published?
Right.
Would you still write? And that's something I would like to be able to say, well, of course I would.
Well,
but I don't know.
Yeah, but so I think a lot about this too, because I'm reading Joyce right now with my kids in class, and he has this line where nobody really knew how he went about the mean task of earning a living, And Dublin is so fantastic. It's so good. It's so raw. It's mean though. It's mean and not uncharitable, but it's mean. It's like it's clear, and it's not dressed up. And when I think about what you're talking about here in terms of your vocation as a writer, we of course do have to busy ourselves with the mean task of living. We have to earn a living. And so I think that's why you're always conflicted when you have a young buck who comes your way and says, "Oh, Mr. Dreer, I want to be a journalist." You're like, "Buddy, I'm not sure it's the ticket to ride that you might think it is, because it's not." We know that journalism, like everything else, is broken.
Right.
But, Dante sees Florence really for the first time when he leaves.
Yeah.
And, Dante writes the Divine Comedy. There are no publishing companies. Like, there's no Amazon, there's no Simon and Schuster or Farrar, whatever. There's no Random House. There's none of these things. And he has to write this thing. He's in exile. He's serving at the the charity of some nobleman in, what is it, Padua, I think. Is that where he is?
Can Grande della Scala was in, I don't know if it was Padua.
Whatever.
He ended up in Ravenna. That's where he died, in Ravenna.
Right. Yeah. Not Florence, in other words, right? And he's writing with zero expectation. I think he has a hope, and I think he knows that he's good. I mean, that's clear, and some people will even get a little persnickety about his seeming arrogance, but I think that's humility. Actually, I think he knows himself. He knows what he's doing, what he's undertaking is the real deal. But I mean, like, what does he hope? What kind of realistic hope does he have that the Divine Comedy, or the comedy as he called it, was going to move the needle?
Yeah. I think we know that he wrote for the future and hoping that this would be its vindication,
but not as a mechanism by which to eke out or the mean task of earning a living.
Right. No, he in fact, he died in Ravenna coming back from a diplomatic mission. I mean, he had to make his money. He was, well, let me, you're a teacher, and we can, maybe in the next podcast, we could talk about that, but you could not be a teacher if you didn't have students. A writer, right. A writer has to have an audience, has to have readers. The same way a singer, what's the point of being a singer if there's no one to hear you? I mean, God's there, God can hear you, and you can still make beautiful music, but there's something deeply unsatisfying about writing things or trying to communicate something if there's no one to read it, to hear it, to see it,
Well, no, that's great. No, that's wonderful. I mean, I think you sort of, you buried the lead there a little bit, but I do think that God's there, right? And it has to start with some recognition of that. But I contend that anytime you set, you take out a pen and you start jotting things down, or you flip open your keyboard and you open up a document, you start typing, you are always addressing the other, right? You're always addressing something outside of yourself. And I as a Christian, I think this is one of the sort of the phenomena that shows me that, there's something outside of myself and ultimately even beyond, so that when I sit down, and if nobody else reads it, I know that God does in a sort of strange, mystical sort of way. So that's why it's a calling. It's a calling, whether or not you're going to get paid a shit ton of money at New York Times, or you're going to, break out and start a Substack, or you're just going to do something like me, like open up a WordPress and start typing and hoping 10 people read it. I mean,
well, remember, you've been told this too. If you ever go to the cathedral at Chartres or any medieval cathedral, they will tell you that on the bird's eye view of these cathedrals, there is still beauty there, because even though nobody on earth would see this, the craftsmen whose names we are lost to us knew that God could see it, and they were making things for the greater glory of God and to please him. So I think that's part of it too. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about this Hungarian poet his work I've been introduced to here, Miklos Radnati. He was a Jew who converted to Catholicism, and he died in the Second World War. The fact that he was a Catholic did not save him from. But when he died, they found he was in a work camp or on some work detail. They found in his pocket some poems. He was writing poems until the day he died, not knowing if anybody would ever see them. I mean, that is a true artist.
Amen. I mean, and that's what I think, has to sort of be our, I think you have to do the work. Look, you have to respond to the call, and if that means you've got a small following online, or a couple of thousand people buy your book or whatever it is, I still think you have to do the thing. But sort of to take this back, one more time to you, if you could sort of succinctly say, what do you feel is really the threat for this new president? I mean, you found your vocation essentially at LSU.
Oh, well, I think the threat is, and it's not just at LSU, but it's
right. But I'm making this right to you. Yeah.
Right. Is that young people will not be able to find their vocation because they'll be too afraid to think outside the box. They'll be too afraid. They'll be too conformist. I mean, remember, I came from a conservative culture, in a small town, Louisiana, born in the 70s and 80s. I came from a conservative culture, and going to a place like LSU was a place to think more liberally in the best possible sense, not only in the specific political sense, but in the best possible sense to examine things. It was wonderful. I would want my kids to have the same thing, and every kid to have the same thing. But we are, is it the case that it will have turned out to have been just a brief interlude between periods of great conformity? And I think of all the young people who really do have a vocation to write or to think or to teach, yet they get it crushed out of them by this crazy conformity. I mean, I was thinking, Kale, about I met this guy who came. A couple of young men came through Baton Rouge a couple months ago, helping somebody move to town, and they're undergraduates in Virginia, at state institutions of Virginia, and they're readers of my work and wanted to meet. We met for Po' Boys, and anyway, they were telling me in detail about how they keep their mouths shut in their classrooms because not only fearing the teacher, but fearing the fellow students. And how ashamed they are of it. And to think that, I don't know that exists at LSU. I don't have any reason to think it exists at LSU, but the more woke LSU becomes, the more that's going to happen. And it is a travesty, whether you're a young person, the left, of the right, of the center, that should not happen.
Right. I mean, in essence, I think the sad part of it, and we can sort of end here, is it keeps everybody from being better. It keeps minds that need to be sharpened dull. It keeps sensibilities that need to be awakened muted, and that's a tragedy. And I can only hope that people find a mechanism by which they can find something to hear the voice to respond to the call. So.
Well, I'm glad we're closing down here because you froze them again. But
I think people can still hear me. So, look, this is great, Rod. I really thank you for sort of opening up a little bit here, talking about your vocation as a writer. I think people are interested in this sort of thing. That's my contention. So, what you got to close us out here?
I got to learn to say "don't get nothing on you" in Hungarian, but I did learn some Hungarian. It's a fantastically complicated language, and nobody learns it. It's not related to anything else that people can figure. But I learned because we did with Orthodox Christians. I went to Easter services here. We say "Christ is risen, Christus feltemat."
Christus feltemat.
Christus feltemat, and the response. Truly he is risen as Valoban feltamat. So Christus feltamat, Valoban feltamat. And the saw has started upstairs, Kale, so I better say goodbye.
This is our side. All right, don't get nothing on you. Be good.
All right, bye.